is our third and last lesson for the chapter 8 in the book of Hebrews. So we're going to continue on basically where we left off before. We were talking about the tabernacle. But before that, we were talking about this contrast between the old tabernacle and the new tabernacle. And let's go back and read. I'll start reading verse 1, chapter 8. And I think bringing us up to verse 7 will help us understand what's going on here. Now, the things which we have spoken of, this is the sum, or the main point. We have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices wherever it is necessary that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were a high priest on earth, if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to law, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou makest all things according to the pattern shown thee in the mount. But now, there's another one of those connecting words that I asked you to look for at the very beginning of the year. But now hath he, Jesus, obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much he is the mediator, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. Now notice what he just says here. Jesus is he is a mediator of a better covenant. A better covenant. I told you before that this word covenant is tied to the word testament. We've already seen this, that the word covenant is tied to the word testament. Old Testament, New Testament. Old covenant, New covenant. Jesus is a mediator of a new covenant. He is a mediator of a new testament. Isn't that something? We've already talked about this before, and how important it is to understand that Jesus is the one bringing in a new covenant. He is the one bringing in a New Testament. We saw it back in chapter 7, verse 22. By so much, Jesus was a surety of a better testament, a better covenant. It's established on better promises. Now, when he says this, if you have a new covenant, I told you before the illustration of the World War I was not World War I until there was a World War II. And all of a sudden, if there's a World War II, then there has to be a one. Before then, it was called the Great War. Okay, if there is the establishment of a New Testament with a new covenant that is a better covenant established on better prophecies, where does that leave the old one? What kind of position does that place the old covenant at? Well, the old covenant had problems. And the writer is not ashamed or not scared, I guess you could say. He doesn't hold back from telling us that it did. Look in verse 7. For, there's another one of those connecting words, there's another one, for if that first covenant had been faultless, there should no place have been sought for the second. Notice in verse 8, for finding fault with them, he saith. Wow. God found fault with the old covenant? Okay, let's look at our slides and see if we can catch up where we are here. The high priest, kind of, again, like we always do, going back to what we said before, the high priest must have something to offer. Christ must have something to offer. There are already priests on earth to offer gifts. They serve as an example and a shadow of the heavenly. Moses was instructed to build the tabernacle based on a pattern given to him. And we have that quotation of Exodus chapter 25. And the tabernacles did there display deep truths. Now, by the way, what was the tabernacle there for? We should have talked about this before I read these other verses, but let me just mention this slide. This is really good. The tabernacle was there. The tabernacle was there to tell us some wonderful, wonderful things. The need of man and the grace of God. The tabernacle reminded the Hebrews every day that they were apart from God. It reminded the Hebrews every day that sacrifice had to be made for their sins. It reminded Hebrews every day that they were not worthy to go into the presence of God. It reminded the Hebrews every day that God had made a plan for them, that God cared for them, and God was making a plan for them. It showed, in a very rudimentary sense, the plan of atonement. And it ultimately brings us to understand that the eternal redemption is provided through the Son. The tabernacle had great spiritual meaning, but I love what Calvin said. There was no cause for us to be expressly curious and seek some blind mystery in every nail in the tabernacle, or other similar details. No, it was there to show wonderful, wonderful things. But one thing it shows is that there must become a new way and a better way. Christ established a better covenant, a more excellent ministry, established on better promises. And back to where I was at a moment ago, the old covenant was faulty. The old covenant had faults. The old covenant was not without its concerns. It had faults. And to show that, he quotes a long quotation here from the book of Jeremiah, verse 8, chapter 8, verse 8. For finding fault with him, he saith, quote, and this is a quote from the Old Testament, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made their fathers in the day when I took them out of the land, took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, here's the covenant, after those days, saith the Lord, I will put my laws into their hearts and write them in their, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. End quote. This comes right out of the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. How Jeremiah 31 is the new covenant. God makes a new covenant with his people. God tells Jeremiah to say, I am going to establish a new covenant, and this new covenant is the covenant. Now look in verse 13 of this, the last verse of this chapter. In that he saith, a new covenant, he had made the first old. There you go. When you have the second war, the first one's the old one. When you have the new one, the other one's the old one. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. We are no longer under the new covenant. The very fact that a new covenant is needed is proof of the imperfection of the old. It was faulty. I use the word imperfection, fine. He found fault with it, didn't he? Now, this new covenant comes from Jeremiah 31 through 34. Look at this slide. It's a future age of grace and blessedness. God says, I will make a new covenant. It's a time, ultimately, that he hopes to have a reconciliation between Judah and Israel. That's what he says in verse 8. It's distinct from the old covenant. It's not that same one he mentions in verse 9. One of the huge differences is instead of the law being written on tables of stone, it's going to be written in their hearts. It's going to be known to everybody, and it is going to be based on grace, and it is going to be eternal. These are some of the wonderful distinctions about the old covenant, the new covenant. Look at this last slide. The old covenant is contrasted to the new. The first covenant is to be done away with. Look in verse 13. The old is ready to vanish away. It's no longer valid. If it's no longer valid. Somebody say, well, that's Old Testament. Well, sometimes we can say that. Hey, you can't eat this. That's Old Testament. You're right. It's Old Testament. It's done away with. You have to follow this rule. No, that's Old Testament. It's done away with. These were done away with. They're no longer valid. They're no longer needed. Remember, I told you the other day about the law of God being a child leader to lead us to Christ. When I read those verses in Galatians, God is leading us along, and was leading the children of Hebrew, the Hebrew children along, like you would deal with a small child. Remember the story about the ditch, and my children going across the ditch. I had a ditch both places we lived. It was dangerous to go across the ditch. In fact, it was more dangerous the second place. But when they got older, I no longer had that rule, even though there was a ditch, and even though it was even more dangerous. Why? Because I grew up, and they could understand now that there was something beyond the rule. There was something that the rule was based on. There was a principle of the character of God that rule was based on. Principle of the character of God. Principle of something else beyond what the rule was. The principle was the principle of safety. If you go across that ditch, you're liable to get hit and killed. They knew that and understood it and knew how to apply it when they became a teenager. They did not understand that, and so the rule had to be in place and a severe punishment if they broke the rule. When they became teenagers, the rule was no longer necessary. The principle was still there both times. I don't care if you're the President of the United States. If you walk across the ditch and get hit by a car going 60 miles an hour, you're probably going to get killed. It had nothing to do with, I'm old enough I can do what I want. No, I'm old enough I should be able to understand what to do. I should be able to comprehend the principles behind it. The old law was temporary. The old law was external. It was only known to Israel. I mean, that's basically who it was given to, right? It was based on judgment. It was temporary again. It decayeth and waxeth old. It was ready to vanish away. And now we have a new covenant. We have a new covenant. We have a New Testament. We have something brand new where God is wanting to do something wonderful in our hearts and in our lives. Now, to help understand this new covenant, he's going to deal even more detail about the tabernacle. And we're going to look into it in more detail next week when we go into Hebrews chapter 9. So, this week I want you to listen to these 3 videos. I want you to take the quiz that you have listened to these 3 videos. I also will be setting up a quiz that I want you to have read Hebrews, the 8th chapter in our textbook. And I want you to work on the discussion that I will have for you in all this. You'll need to put up a post. Now that last week I said it was going to be Saturday, now that you're getting this early in the week, you can get that done by Friday night. Then you can respond to the others in your class. So everybody responds to everybody else by Sunday night. So make sure you get your initial post by Friday night so people can respond to your post by Saturday night. And so that will take care of our lessons this week. Now, we're moving towards the need of having a test in here. And so we'll be wrapping things up, finishing up into, when we go into chapter 9, it'll talk about the covenant, and chapter 10, we'll be talking about the covenant. There'll be another warning. But I will be stopping at some point, and we can plan on next week. Really, we probably need to have a test by the end of next week, or in our lessons next week, if no later than the following week. We've got to have a test to go over what we had so far. I'll talk more about that to you the first of next week. Other than that, God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this, and until later.